Textbooks, Hollywood, even Google. They all tell you stories about a dark and wild period lasting 1,000 years. War, looting, erased knowledge. They all told you about a dark and wild age that lasted 1,000 years. Dark Ages. But what if I showed you? This was the time that created these masterpieces and these inventions, and even the world's first universities. Then who lied and why? To understand why the Middle Ages were labeled as dark, we need to go back to the 14th century and meet an Italian poet named Francesco Petrarch. Petrarch was the first to divide history into three phases: glorious antiquity, the dark middle era, and the rebirth, the Renaissance. According to him, after the fall of Rome, Europe fell into a time of tenebrae darkness. Only with the Renaissance did the light return. Sounds reasonable, but there's a small problem. Petrarch wasn't a historian, he was a poet. And like every artist, he needed a compelling story to sell. To prove his era was great, the best way was to make the previous one look terrible. Then in the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire poured fuel on the fire. They called the Middle Ages the Age of Superstition, to glorify their own reason and science. Again, to prove themselves enlightened, they needed to point out someone as dark, and thus, an entire 1,000-year period became the scapegoat. But now, let's look at the Middle Ages through the eyes of a real historian, and you'll discover this was the age when the most magnificent Gothic cathedrals in history were built. These structures weren't just beautiful, they were proof of advanced knowledge in mathematics, physics, and engineering. To construct flying buttresses, rose windows, and soaring towers, medieval craftsmen had to master complex geometry and applied mechanics. This was the era when monks painstakingly copied and preserved the entire Greek-Roman legacy. Without them, we wouldn't have Aristotle, Plato, or Cicero. Monasteries like Cluny and Monte Cassino weren't just religious centers, they were the Google of their time. They stored and transmitted knowledge across Europe. And this was the era that gave birth to the world's first universities. Bologna in 1088, specializing in law. Paris in 1150, theology and philosophy. Oxford in 1167, producing top scholars. They invented water wheels, windmills, wheeled plows, and the three-field crop rotation system, which doubled agricultural productivity. During this time, trade flourished. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Hamburg became international trade centers. And the famous Silk Road also thrived during this era. They developed modern musical notation and advanced book decoration arts. But wait, did they believe the Earth was flat? Absolutely not! Since the 8th century, nearly all medieval scholars knew the Earth was spherical. They even calculated its circumference quite accurately. What about hygiene? Didn't they bathe? Wrong again! The Middle Ages had many public bathhouses. Bathing only declined in the 16th, 17th centuries when the Renaissance began. And medicine? Did they heal by praying? Medieval doctors performed eye surgery, set broken bones, and even conducted brain surgeries. The Salerno Medical School from the 9th century trained doctors for all of Europe. They translated and studied scientific works from Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas created highly complex and sophisticated philosophical systems. So why were these truths hidden? Because the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras were darker than the Middle Ages in many ways. The infamous witch hunts, they peaked in the 16th, 17th centuries, a time of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, not the Middle Ages. The Renaissance destroyed thousands of medieval artworks, dismissing them as backward and crude. And the so-called rational Enlightenment, it was an age of racial slavery, brutal colonization, and some of the most horrifying wars in European history. Meanwhile, the Middle Ages had no racial slavery. In fact, slavery had essentially disappeared by the 11th century. So who was truly dark? Today, historians have completely abandoned the term Dark Ages. Instead, they call it the early medieval period. Because they've realized this wasn't a dark age, it was a time of transformation, creativity, and the foundation for the modern world. So, history is written by the victors, and sometimes to prove they're great, they have to smear those who came before. The Middle Ages weren't perfect. There were wars, plagues, and poverty. But what era didn't have those? The important thing is they gave us universities, Gothic cathedrals, legal systems, and even the modern scientific method. Perhaps instead of calling them dark, we should call them the torchbearers. And you? Did you believe in the Dark Ages story? Let me know in the comments. If this video changed your view of history, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more shocking truths.